Now, are there reliability professionals in the situations you know in pastoralist areas of Marsabit or semi-arid, arid areas of Kenya? I don't know. But I would certainly say if you're training for reliability professionals, the first thing you want to do is find a group of people, a network who is very good scanning their environment for pastoralist to pastoralist interactions. Okay? That is the immediate real-time thing. I can't think of anything better. And I'm now going to move on to another slide which makes the same point from a different direction. Okay? So again, the issue is, could we have the next slide, please? Sure. Complex, okay? But just follow what I'm going to do, okay? This slide, the upshot of this slide is that reliability professionals add knowledge. They have unique knowledge. Networks have unique knowledge about the system to be managed. And that without them, you're screwed. So in the electricity case, and then I will talk about pastoralist policy. So I've done the pastoralist stuff here, but please let me get to it. I'll explain it through the normal course. Huge systems where the mandate of reliability have two dimensions at least. One dimension is the scope of the reliability focus. Is it focused on the system or is it focused on the event? The system is the California transmission grid for electricity. The event is what happens in Fresno that could screw things up. Fresno being a city, an important city that could affect part of the grid. And the knowledge base that they have runs from representational or formal rule-based knowledge down to what we now call experiential or tacit knowledge. You know, knowledge that you can't express is rule and procedures. But nonetheless, which we know, of course, as pastoralists are very good at. Okay? Now, I cannot tell you, I have been trained in public policy, and the first mistake they trained me in was the belief that you can macro design all micro operations. Imagine a set of formal rules and procedures, call it policy and regulation, that is so constructed that it governs directly every single thing you do in the field. Every micro operations out there. In complex systems and critical infrastructures, you can't do that. There's no way you could be reliable if you really thought you could macro design representational knowledge at the system-wide level for everything down that is at the local field. You need to tack like a sailboat tacks into the wind. You have to get through it not directly, but indirectly. In the first case, you need a set of people who are very good at scenario formulation. Let me give an example of that. Scenario formulation is the policy says A, B, and C, and you go down, and yet there are people who will say, well, for our area at this time, the best way to implement A, B, and C is A1, B1, C1. It's not a direct template, direct line, but you have to adapt it to the local context. Okay? Now, an example from Botswana from many years ago, but it's a wonderful example. At that time, the land boards, the so-called traditional, they weren't traditional, but the so-called traditional land boards followed a rule of borehole spacing 5 miles, 8 kilometers apart. So here would be, if you drilled a new borehole, it should be only spaced at least 8 kilometers away from the nearest borehole. Okay. So, and I kept saying, I was advising the land board at the time, and I said, "You're sure?" "Yeah, we follow the rule." And so I decided to map every borehole. And you know what, right? Okay. So then I go to the land board and I say, listen, you know, your rule is 8 kilometers apart, and yet over and over again, and not from just the colonial period, but like last year, you approved boreholes that were closer than 8 kilometers. And they looked at me as if I was dumb, and they basically said to me, of course it's our policy, but we would be dumb not to adapt the policy for local conditions. Okay? You don't believe it, just because it's our policy, official policy, doesn't mean that the local conditions can't be taken into account. Now, we may step back and say they're being political, they're being expedient, they're being self-serving, etc. But I actually believed them, in part. That this says that the 8-kilometer rule has to be adapted to local conditions. Okay? The aquifer may be different. Okay? Boreholes had been drilled there earlier, which went out of operation, but may come back, but nonetheless they are while drilled, not being used, etc. There are contingent local factors that explain why government policy from Nairobi is necessarily adapted to Marsabit district in a way it is not adapted to, take another district. Yes, any other district. That's why you have counties here, folks, to recognize the need to differentiate. I mean, for all the politics, dollars, and jerks reasons, you also have that there are differences that have to be accounted for at the county level, even in policy. But there's another. So these guys I'm talking about, networks, are very good at scenario formulation, taking the national, applying it to the local. In your case, the district or county, or even the sub-county level, if you wanted to go there. Now, there's another set of skills. This is the micro operations. So here you have the resilient herder, the resilient community. And they're facing drought after drought after drought. And it's a household. And they're having to respond. They're sending their kids off to the city. They're trying to do something. They're watching their herd die. Some may even want to sell the herd, parts of the herd, before they all die off. Okay, those are trying in order to maintain a reliable livelihood in the face of the drought. Do you see that? There's micro operations. But if we went and did a sample of all of the micro operations by all of the pastoralists over the course of the 3-year drought that you had, or 2-year drought that you had, we will see that better practices of responding to that drought were developing. People did not uniformly, they were victims, but people did not uniformly respond to to survive that drought. There was variability, there was diversity, and so on. In fact, practices evolve over a diverse set of cases we call pattern recognition. If there is a pattern that forms over the run of diverse cases, that the better cases are ones that responded to A, B, and C, responded to A, B, and C with X, Y, and Z, those are the ones you want to learn from. Okay? So we have pattern recognition as another skill. So again, to go back to what the case we just left, the reliability professional is one who is in a network of people who, some of whom do scenario formulation really well, and some of whom you would want who are looking to pastoralist better practices. Do you see? This is the reinforcement of what I just said previously. Really existing practices that people have evolved in together or separately that will handle more or produce more stable livelihoods or outcomes. Now, one of the major features of this is, notice, pattern recognition at the system-wide level is never the same thing as macro design. There's a difference. Pattern recognition relies on real people, the knowledge they've gained over time. Macro design is just some government policy. You know, I mean, it's just a law and a regulation. I mean, yeah, they're important, but it's to say this is the way the things should be, this is the way the things are. There is always a gap between policy at the macro level and the patterns you see with real people in real time, with real problems, generating real practices, with each other or not with each other. That is up to you to determine. And it is in between the scenario formulation and the pattern recognition that you have reliability professionals adding knowledge. They couldn't connect. This system wouldn't be able to work. Highly complex, policy-driven environment wouldn't work reliably if it didn't have the people in the middle trying to take the scenarios they face and the patterns they face and putting them together to be reliable. Reliable for what? Reliable now with respect to the systems they manage, to the standards they adopt, real standards they adopt, and for the risks and resiliencies they face. And these people in the pattern recognition, again, I'm not saying they're there, but I'm saying you're looking for people who, if they're not there, are very good open to understanding just why pastoralist better practices are important. They increase your options in real time, and they handle this defect of the fact that while the government may say they're macro designing every micro operation, that can't happen. It doesn't happen in water supplies, it doesn't happen in electricity grids, it doesn't happen anywhere that is an infrastructure. That's the primary purchase of the infrastructure knowledge. Okay, could we have the next slide, please? Now, what are they doing in the middle? Between the scenarios that they're very good at making, and the patterns, seeing the patterns they're good at, and then putting the two together so that at least the system is reliable now. Why do I come back reliable now? Why can't I guarantee you that you should be building a system that's reliable not just now, but like indefinitely? Why is real time now so important? Pardon me? Okay. If you cannot manage reliably now, why should I believe your promise you know how to do it 10 years down the line? Why should I, if you cannot manage now and in the next step ahead reliably, why ever should I believe your promises that you'll do better with more resources? Do you see that? That's what pastoralists do. At least that's what critical control room infrastructures do. They know that if they cannot keep those lights on now, the water coming from the tap now, the natural gas going to the oven now, why ever would anyone believe they can do it better later? It's a skill. You wish it could be for longer, but the point is you can't expect longer if they don't do it right now and show you how they do it. So what are they doing? How are they able to keep the resource, the service, the critical service reliable? And what it is they operate within a comfort zone. They manage risks as well as some uncertainties. Okay. Remember I said one of the most important parts of reliability professionals is their ability to manage uncertainty. Now we're going to define it. Okay, so you understand exactly what I mean with respect to managing uncertainty. This is a very, very famous 2x2 typology. And it basically says risk is where you know the probability of failure and the consequences of failure. Know is a big word, okay? You might know a little bit more or a little bit less. But let's say you're pretty confident you know what are the probabilities, the chances of the system failing, and the consequences of this system failing. Again, this system failing is, that system is bound in real time for actual management to the standard that it is being managed to. So there's risk. But these systems, as I just described to you, would never be reliable if they were managing only risks. They'd all be dead. Okay. Part of the problem, well, let's just leave it at that. So there are uncertainties that they manage, and they manage uncertainties in order to stay out of unstudied conditions. Ignorance. So in a world in which you have specified or well-defined knowledge about outcomes and empirical basis, knowledge about likelihoods, you get formal risk management. You will be sold, you will have people telling you that what pastoralists need to do is better manage risks. No. Listen, to say pastoralists need to better manage risks is to say that those are risks that can actually be determined in the form of knowledge and consequences. But you live in an environment where you don't have full knowledge or adequate knowledge and of consequences or likelihood. You live in an environment where there may be more knowledge about consequences than there are likelihoods, or more knowledge about failures than there are of consequences. Just to sort of say, treat the world as if it could be reduced to risk alone is something that would kill pastoralists. And in fact, it has actually destroyed many important infrastructure units, because the whole point is the control room operators know how to manage uncertainty in a way that the formal risk methodologies never allow them to do. Now, what does that mean for pastoralists? Pastoralists may be in these two cells. What does that mean? It may mean that pastoralists, for example, are more confident in knowing that they can send their kids off or their children off to the cities in order to get remittances back from their work. Not perfect knowledge, right? They may be more confident of that management strategy than they are confident about what to do for a 3-year drought. A 3-year drought, when that drought started, that was unknown conditions. No one knew it would last that long. There were lots of unknown unknowns. And for pastoralists, they don't want to have to survive in unknown unknowns. Control room don't want to survive in unknown unknowns. That's unstudied conditions. Better to manage uncertainties, i.e. send your kids off to send money back home, which is no guarantee either, but at least you can be more confident about that strategy than it is to sit there at the start of a 3-year drought and say, here I know what I have to do in the 3-year drought that's coming up ahead, if you knew it. Do you see that? That means that one of the policy implications of this is that the people who identify the consequences are also the people who identify the likelihoods. That's what people miss in a figure like that. The best form of uncertainty and risk management is where the same people who identify consequences are the same people who identify likelihoods. You will work, again, I know nothing about your current policy situation, but I can guarantee you work in an environment where a different group is identifying the consequences than are identifying the risks. The consequences of building a road, the probability of that road failing may be done by different consultants, they may be done by different groups, they may change over time, but these reliability professionals I'm talking about, or the ones you're looking for, do it. Both of them, at the same time. There's no sort of separating that knowledge out. And they do it because they fear in terms of acting ignorantly. Uncertainty. Could I have the next slide, please? So that's what they're doing in the middle of scenario formulation and so on. comes the importance of, I know some of you were asking me about definitions and terminology of volatility and so on. This is where it becomes important to make distinctions for identifying reliability professionals. You will hear, and if you haven't heard, many people treat the word control and the word management as if they're one and the same thing. Oh, I love that. Many people treat the word control and management as if they are the same thing. Okay? They are not. An infrastructure approach tells you to distinguish control from management. We manage because we can't control. Control means that I have control over the inputs, the processes, and the output. I'm like a nuclear reactor, guns, guards, and gates. I can stop you from going in. I have complete control of the inputs. I have complete control of the processes. And I have complete control of the outputs. The situations you face is your inputs are variable, yet you still are demanded to provide reliable livelihoods. No one's changed that rule. And so your process variance has to be high. Options and reliability, options and strategies. Okay? So the fundamental thing are people who, while they may not define it as I just defined it, are able to distinguish between management and control. They manage because they can't control. Or they cope when they can't even manage. Cope, what does cope mean? Coping is what you do when the output variance is high. There's no way to keep livelihoods sort of stable, okay? It's a situation where you've lost the ability to even manage. That is, lost the ability to increase process variance, process variability, options variability in order to be reliable. And that is, again, so important because outsiders may come into this area, you know, an earlier version of me comes into a pastoralist area, looks at you after 3 years of drought and says, why can't you people understand drought is inevitable? Why can't you people understand you've got to get greater control over it? Why can't you people understand that it is all about better risk management? That is the absolutely lethal piece of advice. If you ever hear that, don't believe a word of it. Okay? The issue is not to get greater control. The issue is to improve your ability to manage. The issue is not to reduce everything to risk, as in drought risk reduction. It is to realize that, hey, these guys are not only doing risk management, they're doing uncertainty management. It's something that I tell you, economists and engineers trained in formal disciplines have a very hard time understanding. That is why it's so important to understand pastoralists as a global infrastructure. Because you can look to other infrastructures and see the same things I'm talking about. Control rooms distinguish between management and control. Control rooms understand that coping isn't just I'm a victim and things happen to me. Coping is really coping ahead in the next step or two. Coping requires reliability professionals to actually start thinking about what to do in the next step or the step ahead. They're not passive victims waiting for the tsunami or the earthquake to kill them. Okay? The reliability professionals I'm talking about are in networks, and they may be the only thing between you and death. The only thing between you and death may be these professionals in real time. That is the added purchase of the infrastructure approach. This bit about pastoralists being marginal, I hate the word marginal. I mean, I just don't understand it. I mean, 50 years ago when I went to Botswana, this was the marginal lands. No one lives here. Of course they live here. They're the Basara, the Bushmen. They were never empty, okay? So they're marginal lands waiting to develop. Now I'm told pastoralists are marginalized, okay? That is, the power structure makes them marginal. Every word of that may be true, but they are not marginal as an infrastructure, a global infrastructure. Anytime you go to donors and you hear this word about marginal and marginalized, say, wait a minute, they are actually global. People who are increasing the process variance through management strategies that include adept ways to deal with uncertainties in ways that even formal risk managementers can't do. Hey, but this is the Anthropocene, folks. I mean, we need more of it, more people like this. We don't need fewer, and we certainly don't need to reduce the world to formal risk. Could I have the next slide, please? And so what happens is still today, we have people who say we have to control risks, when in fact the real people know we have to manage risks. We also have to manage uncertainty, proactively manage uncertainty. It seems hard, but think about it. The guy who would rather send his kids to the city, his young adults to the city, because at least they may have a chance to work and send remittances back, is managing uncertainty, not risks. And then for coping, of course, there are situations where simply we can't manage yet alone control. But not coping being, again, we need to be proactive. Well, okay, we're coping, but what to do in this step and the next step ahead. Next slide, please. So, I sort of telegraphed ahead about these conclusions, but let's go through. This is where this infrastructure approach I described leads you to. In practical terms, a pastoral system is only as reliable as the next failure head. The same thing has been said of other infrastructures. Let me repeat that. The electricity grid, be it here or in Washington, D.C., the electricity grid is only reliable until the next failure head. Okay? They know it's because failure is a really existing thing that they have to manage against it. They so dread it that they have to manage against it. The key criterion of success is thus disasters averted. All the disasters, I've been here for an hour and a half. I can tell you there was probably at least one event that was averted that would have disrupted this electricity that you get in Marsabit. You don't see it. All you see is the lights are on. That's what makes it reliable. That's what you, the customer or the citizen, want to see. The lights stay on, the water comes. But to get to that, disasters have to be averted. And the problem with what the infrastructure approach, the good thing about it is to remind policymakers, i.e. funders, that disasters averted has a huge financial benefit. Huge, 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 huge financial benefit that goes underestimated. And it goes underestimated by them, not by the reliability professionals. They know exactly what they're doing. They're averting disaster. Okay? So that if you want to sell to the donors and the donors want to move money, they must understand that these pastoral systems as a global infrastructure are a huge financial addition to the world in real terms. Core to managing system reliability are reliability professionals who, by virtue of their skills, I'm repeating myself, hopefully, in system-wide pattern recognition and local scenario formulation, are able to translate the system patterns they see and the local scenarios they face into real time. Into reliability. In this way, they have unique knowledge of the system. Is this guaranteed? Is this always guaranteed? No. These people are not ideal types. These are really human beings that have existing human beings that have families and other concerns. But they do a better job than the macro designers, and they do a better job than the micro operator on his or her own in the field. That's what you get with these networks. They do a better job than people who think that I set the policy and ergo everything is done. Or, hey, why don't you learn from me? I fight fires at the front line. Why don't you learn from me? No one ever asked me as a teacher. Well, I'm sorry, folks, but I'm not worried about you as a teacher or a firefighter. I want to know what a run of cases the teachers and firefighters do. And I want to see, compare what you do here to what, in fact, we've learned over a run of cases as better practice. That's your concern. Politicians, they're on a different axis in this environment. And then I don't want to repeat, we went through the building blocks of parsing out the initial thing. This is all the slides will be available if you talk to CRDD, and I have notes for each of the slide there. So please, if you have further questions about the slides, talk to them, and I'm a phone call away, a Zoom call away through CRDD for more specific cases. Next slide, please. Pastoralism as infrastructure provides the world a key critical service. Like other major globalizing infrastructures, pastoralism seek to increase process variance. Think real-time management strategy and options in the face of high but unpredictable or uncontrollable input variance, not just environmental variability, but economic variability, in order to achieve low and stable output variance, and no longer, again, just the herd, but livelihoods. That key service, boosting and amplifying process variance, especially real-time management strategies and options, is foundational, I argue, for world economic development in times of high uncertainty and complexity. When was the last time you were told pastoralists play a key part in that? That is why these systems matter. They're all over the world doing this under Anthropocene conditions, which are, if anything, going to get worse before they get better. That's the end of the preaching. Now I go to the part that I like most of all. Having said all these big words and things, what are the policy implications, management implications? And I have time for 8 before we end, but these may not apply to Marsabit, but they clearly differ from current policy implications about pastoralists and pastoralist systems. Could I have the next slide? The one preceding that? Okay. Now, again, I'm asking you to think in Marsabit terms, but also thinking now in terms of pastoralism as global infrastructure. And I have 8 different ones, and they're not in order of priority. One doesn't mean it's the first important. There are just 8 I drew out of my head. There are many different other ones, okay? The infrastructure framework, which I just presented, suggests that instead of talking about environmental risks associated with pastoralism, the climate risks of land degradation and methane production, cattle, we should be comparing the environmental footprints produced by the respective global infrastructures, roads globally, electricity globally, dams globally. What are the environmental impacts of other infrastructures? Now it's true because pastoralisms rely on these other infrastructures, like you need to transport livestock to market, you may transport water into the arid area. When water is out, they rely on roads. The respective footprints overlap. But the physical damage done to the environment by roads, dams, and power plants is well documented and clearly extend beyond the pastoralist impact globally. Do you see what I mean? The next time they tell you that what we got to do is get rid of cattle because they may have methane production, is you just have to say, excuse me, but as an infrastructure, that's doing a lot less impact than all the damn roads and dams and electricity plants are doing. Clearly doing. Not something Emery Road pulled out of the air. Documented damage done to the environment by roads for other uses, dams for other uses, and so on. Second implication, and again, it's not the second in priority. No large critical infrastructure can run 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year at 100% capacity and be reliable. Let me repeat that. Once you understand that the production of electricity or water, even under normal operations, has its ups and downs, no system is reliable that is operated invariantly all the time, okay? Invariantly all the time. So this policy implication of this one is that, to understand, it's absolutely ludicrous then to imagine an ideal type, that somehow the most optimal or ideal pastoralist enterprise is a ranch 8 kilometers by 8 kilometers of fencing with a borehole in the middle, which I was once told was the optimal ranch. 5 miles by 5 miles, 4 paddocks, and the borehole in the middle. That doesn't exist. That never existed, by the way. It only was talked about because those people imported notions of optimality into systems they neither understood in terms of what they were actually managed to standards that they actually managed to for risks and resiliencies that followed from that. So again, this means comparing pastoralist livestock systems to a benchmark of optimized grassland ranching or intensive dairy production is ludicrous, if only because the latter, I mean the optimized ones, are more likely to fail sooner anyway than pastoral systems are. Next slide, please. Restocking. Okay. Restocking schemes are routinely criticized for returning livestock to low-resource rangelands. Restocking goats, restocking cattle. I should be familiar here. Yet the infrastructure for government commodity buffer stocks, holding grain, wool, or oil to stabilize the prices of those commodities, is just as routinely recommended by the experts. Okay. Maybe restocking schemes here are popular, are well used, and well established. They have no problems here. People are very happy with it. Fair enough. But typically, the stuff that I've read, that they're always somebody in the system, the donors or the policymakers, who say, listen, you're putting more goats and cattle on a land that is already degraded. Isn't that the dumbest thing you can do? It's blasted heath, it's hard pan, water just runs off of it. How can you do that? And yet, the experts recommend building infrastructure for infrastructures that have buffer stocks like that, oil and cotton and stuff, to keep the prices stable in times when demand is high, prices for wool or oil go up, demand is low, prices go down. You release the buffer stocks in order to stabilize the output, in this case, the output price. So again, think of restocking schemes as such buffers. That's buffer stocks. That's what they are, actually, in infrastructure terms. They are not returning goats to a degraded, overgrazed hard pan. They are returning goats in order to stabilize the livelihoods of the households, who presumably, let's hope, have some say over which goats are coming their way. A livestock raid, another example from an infrastructure viewpoint. A livestock raid undertaken by one pastoralist group on another in order to repair or restore its herd numbers differs from the livestock raid undertaken as an emergency response to having the entire system of operations or herd disappear because of some system-wide calamity like a drought. The policy and management implications differ because in one, you are restoring back to a system's normal operations, the old normal operations, Whereas in the latter, you're recovering to a new normal, which requires far and more different stakeholders. This may have no application to the situation that you are familiar with. Oh, well, I told you there was that one thing they didn't prevent. Perfect example. So that one was basically the argument that I'm not saying you have livestock raids in Marsabit for those reasons. It's probably much more complex, inter-ethnic conflict and so on. Young people all over the Sahel are involved in raids for other purposes than restoring herds back to an old normal or recovering herds back to a new normal. I am, however, saying that you need to make a quite clear distinction why raiding, that is the transfer of cattle from one side to another, and then the response, you have to make it understand why is it happening in terms of the notions of restoration to an old normal or recovery to a new normal. That is profoundly important in this framework, because a new normal has to involve other stakeholders than just the herders. A new normal means the system has failed, both sides of that raid have failed. Okay? And that what is being established by these continuing raiding is a new way of life, something different, and that will inevitably bring in not only the politicians, but humanitarian aid agencies and others. And to what end, we don't know, but certainly it will not be a future determined by the two sides of the pastoralists two sides who are doing the raiding. Okay. Then some of the other ones which I can easily read. What's the fifth one? Okay. Oh, perfect. Just in time. This was actually just in time. Also brought to you by me. Okay. We could have number 5, the slide above this one. Pastoral systems are routinely criticized for high inequality of holdings and ownership. I mean, I don't know about your area again, but you read the literature, you know, a few who are always owning all the cattle. And the many down there are, at best, herders, hired herders, if at all paid reasonably. And then you're always asked, but what do you do with the poor woman with 5 goats or fewer? Like, that's my problem. Like, you know, I mean, the issue about high inequality means this. But does that mean redistribution of herd numbers has to be a major centerpiece of producing equally sustainable livelihoods from the infrastructure perspective? From the infrastructure perspective, wouldn't requiring more equality in terms of stable outputs mean having a very different production system or systems, social protection programs, for example, than one centered around inputs and processes of livestock rearing and herding directly? Do I have an answer for what do we do about the poor woman, poor villager with 5 goats or less? No, I don't. But I certainly know from this perspective that you have to think that she may need a different kind of program than giving her 10 goats or more. That's the implication. Whether that's true here or not, I don't know. Next one, please. Start with a conventional point of departure. Pastoralists, including their reliability professionals, are being displaced from their usual herding places by land encroachment, sedentarization, climate change, mining, or other factors. One major question then becomes, what are the compensation, investment, and steering policies of government, among others, think of the others being NGOs, who are there for a long time, like church NGOs, to address this kind of displacement? That is, where are the policies, macro design, where are the policies to compensate herders for loss of productive livelihoods because of displacement, upskill herders in the face of eventually losing their current employment, and or efforts to steer the herding economies and markets in ways that do not lose out if and where new displacement of herding because of land encroachment, so on, occurs. The answer, with the odd exception that proves the rule, no such national policies exist. You go out there and ask your own government, where are the policies to compensate herders who've been forced out by the infamous agriculturalists, and you won't find a compensation. You may find a program or a project, but not a national policy. Where are the investment strategies? Where are the steering strategies? They don't exist. And I would argue that on what Hussein was talking about, the 2026 International Year for Rangelands and Pastoralists, those types of things should be on the agenda. Not overgrazing, not just displacement, but really focusing on where are the national policies after all these years globally. Where are the national policies and why they aren't there? Next slide, please. And this one has hounded me for years. Okay. Rangeland carrying capacity. I thought we had this solved a long time ago, but it turns out none of it's been solved. From an infrastructure policy perspective, what does rangeland carrying capacity look like? Okay, how does it reinterpret the people who say we can't, these areas are overgrazed, they are degraded, where they can't go on, we need to move pastoralists out of their current condition. We know the best answer, we've got to do something, they can't go on this way because their carrying capacity is so exceeded. The key problem with the notion of rangeland carrying capacity is the assumption that it's about livestock. It isn't. Okay, the infrastructure, the pastoralist infrastructure is, guess what, not about livestock. The notion invites you to conjure up livestock shoulder to shoulder on a parcel of land and then ask you, how could this not be a physical limit to the number of livestock on the land? You can't pack anything more. I mean, here's a parcel of land. I'm a sheep, a goat or a sheep. You pack them in there in front around me, and I only get 20 on this parcel of land before I start stacking them on top of each other. How is that not a physical constraint? But that's wrong. From an infrastructure approach, livestock numbers on a piece of land are not a system. They're not a system. The number of its pipes, rods, and valves are not an operating nuclear power plant. I'm sorry to tell you, the components, packed together or not packed together, do not make a nuclear power plant. What makes it a power plant, what makes it a pastoral system is how you manage it. These numbers, these components, in real time, under turbulent conditions. But these limits are set by managing physical constraints, be it LSU per hectare or not. More of this management combines with managing other constraints like access to markets, remittances from household numbers and abroad, land encroachment, and so on. This is the same point we just made about why redistributing herd numbers may not be the better strategy for producing more sustainable livelihoods in pastoralism. It may not, but at least open your mind to that fact, okay? Can herders make management mistakes? Of course. But there again, this is why pastoralist to pastoralist learning is so important around the notion of sharing. That is why you have something the donors and the government don't have. You know that if from an infrastructure viewpoint, no matter how you look at it, from different typologies that I went through, searching out for better practices is important for real-time increase in options. Not a forever solution, but again, if you can increase options now, by talking to other pastoralists who are able to do better than you for a variety of different reasons, if you can't get that from them now, Why ever should I believe government can do better than that, or you? From this system and management framework, it's not rangeland carrying capacity we should be talking about, but rangeland management capacity. Or better yet, rangeland management capacities, as there is not one major, single, only, overarching form of pastoralism. And hey, we saw that yesterday, just on our little road trip. Next slide, please. And this is my last one. As a final illustration, let's look at how to reinterpret rangeland restoration. Many of you have been talked about or maybe even involved in rangeland restoration schemes through the lens of our infrastructure and management framework. Now, restore happens to be a very, very big word in infrastructure studies, okay? Because restore can mean different things. You can restore service that's been interrupted, restore it back to normal operations. You can, so second, service is initially restored after wide failure of infrastructure. That is, now you're recovering your electricity grid after a major islanding event. Or you can restore key equipment or facilities after a non-routine outage, like what we just experienced was a non-routine outage. It was restored back to working, probably by a generator, probably? Was it? Yeah. Now think of rangeland restoration that you're familiar with in terms of the three kind of differences. And I've tried to give an example. None of these may apply to your case, but let's work through it. An example of none. Number one, restoring interruption back to normal. You may have stall feeding, which is here part of normal operations, is restored after an unexpected interruption in its version of a supply chain. So parts of the highlands of Kenya, stall feeding, there may be a supply chain interruption, and you restore back when the feed, the grass is actually restored and supplied back, part of the supply chain. And again, remember, normal operations do not mean invariant. There are always ups and downs, even in huge electricity systems, water supplies. An example of number two, grasslands have been appropriated for other uses by the infamous agriculture, requiring indefinite use of alternative livestock feed and grazing until a better solution is found, if at all. Then, in using South African terms, a large veld fire, lightning strikes are common enough occurrence, though unevenly distributed, takes much of the grasslands out of use, at least until the next rains, if there are the next rains. Herders respond by reverting to more intensive alternative grazing practices for what's left to work with. Now, so what? Why are these distinctions more important from an infrastructural viewpoint? It's this. It's the whole issue of overgrazing. The issue of overgrazing or degradation, okay, can be a sideshow distracting from what is actually going on infrastructurally. Because normal operations, remember, it's the benchmark used here for comparisons. Normal operations are what you wanted to get back to, right? If there's failure. Always has had overgrazing in its operations. Let me repeat that. Normal operations of pastoral herds, like fenced commercial ranches in sub-Saharan Africa, always have had overgrazing as part of their business model. What, for example, do you think the sacrifice grazing around a livestock borehole is about? There is nothing to restore the immediate perimeter of this borehole back to. In fact, that overgrazed perimeter immediately around the borehole in normal operations is an asset for livestock production. It's not a liability, it's an asset. Okay. Again, so what? As I read them, calls for rangeland restoration are a contradiction in infrastructure terminology. Namely, what we're talking about is recovering rangelands back to an old normal. If there's anything I leave to you, you don't recover back to a norm. Recovery means the system has failed. You recover to a new normal. You can restock back to an old normal. But that depends on the actual empirical conditions of the reliability professionals there and their assessment. The real crisis, and to sum this up in a phrase, the real crisis faced in pastoralism today as a global infrastructure is the loss of its reliability professionals. To come in and just say that, oh, the systems we used to manage for are no longer in existence. Oh, the boundaries of these systems are changing. Oh, we no longer manage to that standard of precluding a herd loss. Oh, the risks are infinite now. Facing, we got climate change, we got biodiversity loss, we got an infinite risk. Oh, the real crisis is when reliability professionals disappear, even when borders are changing, even when risks are changing, even when standards are changing. That's their job, is to manage that. Okay, not control it, not to stop it, but to manage it. Do they always succeed? No. But the fact that their job is getting harder means that we have to understand them even more, because their service to the globe is foundational.